Most people who start podcasts want to make money from their podcasts. Now, they don't always have to make money right away or right this instant, but they want to make money at some point. The problem is a lot of people start podcasting thinking that the podcast is automatically going to bring in sales and revenue. And what happens is a lot of podcasters get this backwards. They think that if I can grow my audience, it's going to fix the revenue issues that I'm experiencing, whether that be in your business or whether that be just supporting the process of podcasting. But here's the thing. If you have an offer right now in your business that isn't converting, a bigger audience isn't going to fix it. You're just going to have a bigger audience that doesn't convert. So buckle up, because in this episode, we are going to go up against a huge industry misconception, which is this idea that a podcast can magically fix a sales problem in your business and what you're actually going to need for a podcast that can make you money. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. I speak to podcasters every day, all day long. My team speaks to podcasters in our DMs, in our inbox, on our workshops, in our community. And we hear from people who say, I really want to make money. I need to make money from this podcast. And I get it. When I started my podcast, it was an expense that I had to figure out how to cover elsewhere in my business because the podcast wasn't generating revenue. And so in a sense, I was coming out of pocket to support this content channel. And that's what most people do. They say, okay, I'm going to start this podcast. And I know that I'm going to have to put in some time and energy, right? If you don't have a big budget, maybe you're editing yourself right now, or maybe you've got someone on your team who's helping you with that, a VA. For me, I hired an editor right out the gate because I was like, I know I'm not going to be able to keep up with this unless I have an editor. And so I made room for that in my marketing budget at the time. But at the end of the day, creating a podcast and actually monetizing that podcast are two totally different things. And what a lot of people going into podcasting don't realize is that a podcast is an amplifier, meaning a podcast is going to magnify what's already working in your business and what's not. You might want to skip back and listen to that again because this is so key. And this is something that I really want you to take to heart, because the sooner you realize this, the easier it will be to grow and monetize your podcast. But what happens is a lot of people get into podcasting thinking that podcasting is going to be the vehicle to more income and more impact. And then they just get frustrated because the podcast isn't growing. It's stagnating. It's struggling. People aren't paying attention to it. How am I ever going to make money from this thing if I've only got 12 listeners listening to my episodes? And it can get frustrating really fast. And this is why a lot of people quit. They throw in the towel. Now the statistics say by episode 6. And I don't want this to happen to you. First of all, if you are podcasting and you have made it past episode 6, kudos. Keep going. Don't stop, because podcasting is a compounding effect medium. What I mean by that is it's just like the stock market. You're going to invest a little bit right now. And the idea is to keep investing as much as you can over time. And eventually it's going to reach that point of critical mass where things start to compound and where that effort starts to pay off. Two things that happens to podcasters. Number one, they don't stick with it long enough. Number two, they don't have the right foundations in place going into it, or the right, I hate to use the word mindset because it's so overused in our culture, but the right mindset or the right frame of mind going into it. Let's just say expectations. They don't have the right expectations going into it. And so they just get frustrated. I would be too. I've been podcasting for over 5 years now. And this podcast is now a very integral part of driving leads and sales into our offers. But it wasn't always that way. So what we're going to do inside this episode is we're going to zoom out a little bit beyond just the lens of podcasting. We can look at a podcast and we can say, okay, this isn't working. I want this to work and I want this to work. But at the end of the day, if you have a business and your podcast is meant to support that business, then what we actually need to look at is what's already working well within the business and what's not working, because a podcast is only going to amplify that. Now, before you start to think, oh my gosh, my business is doomed, my podcast is doomed because my business isn't generating the sales that I want it to generate yet, so therefore my podcast isn't going to generate it either. Like, what are you telling me, Courtney? What are we really talking about here? Don't panic, all right? What we want to look at is we want to actually utilize the podcast and your business almost like a mirror of each other. They're going to mirror each other, and one's going to magnify the other. So if your messaging is clear, if you have an offer that is already converting, guess what? A podcast will help you scale it. But on the flip side of that, if you have an offer that's not selling, then a podcast is only going to make that gap more obvious temporarily. But in the long run, it may actually help you fix it for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. So my goal in this episode is to help you know what to expect from a podcast so that you can make better business decisions. Because for you listening right now, you're going to be at a different stage in your journey than someone else listening to this show right now. And everyone's end goal is different, which is why when we work with our clients, we're customizing our approach based on their specific end game. Yes, sure, there's a lot of principles that we teach that are universally applicable to podcasts as a whole, but at the end of the day, your podcast is here to serve you, not for you to be a slave to it. So in order for that podcast to serve you well, you have to be clear on ultimately what you want the podcast to give you. So the way that we're going to break this down is we're going to look at this in 3 ways. We're going to look at this if you do not have an offer yet, and if you never plan to have an offer. Maybe you are podcasting because you want to turn the podcast into a business at some point, but you don't plan to have a business behind the podcast. So we'll take a look at that. We'll also take a look at if you have a business behind the podcast and you have an offer in that business right now that's not converting. And then we'll also look at if you have a business behind the podcast and you have an offer that is converting. And we'll break down what to expect from your podcast at each of these stages. But before we do that, we need to do an exercise together. This is the exact same exercise that I would do with you if you and I were to sit down on a call and you were telling me, hey, Courtney, I want to launch a podcast, but I haven't made it happen yet. Or I have a podcast, but it's just not growing in the way that I expected it to yet. Here's what I would ask you. What are you hoping your podcast will give you? Now, it's funny because when I ask this question, people kind of stop and they look up at the sky. I'm like, dude, the answers are not going to come from the sky. They're going to come from your heart. Okay. So first of all, stop looking at the sky. Close your eyes. Now, if you're driving, don't close your eyes. Maybe come back to this in a minute. Just listen through. But if you're in a place where you can close your eyes, close your eyes. What are you hoping your podcast will give you? Don't try to think about it. Just notice what comes up. What comes to your mind first? What are you hoping a podcast will give you? Now, what I want you to do is I want you to notice whatever pops into your mind. Now, the answer that you thought of is going to be different than the answer that someone else listening thought of. And it doesn't matter what your answer is. I just want to know what your answer is, not what someone else's answer is or what you think the answer should be. And this is the problem with most of the podcasting advice out there, is that it's built for someone else's goals. And this is why so many people follow that advice and then they get frustrated because it's not built for their goals. Okay, so I've been doing this a long time. And I know that your answer, the first answer that popped up, it's not your real answer. Now, in order for you to get clear expectations on the impact that a podcast is going to have for you and for your business, I want you to notice what your answer was that popped up first. Maybe it was, well, to make more income, to make additional revenue, to help build my authority, to help me reach a wider audience, to help me get my message out there in a bigger way. Maybe it was to help me simplify my marketing. Maybe it was a combination of some of these things. Maybe it was something else. So now I want you to think about your answer, and I'm going to ask you again, what is that going to give you? Additional revenue, what does that give you? More authority, okay, great. What does that give you? A bigger audience, a wider audience, more impact. What does that do for you? Simpler marketing, cool. I'm all for simplification and leverage, but what is that going to do for you? Now, for the sake of time here, I'm going to have you pause this episode for a minute or two. And whatever your second answer is, I want you to notice it. And I want you to ask yourself, what does that give me? What does that do for me? Because a lot of times what happens here is people will say additional revenue, well, it's going to help me support my family. Cool. But what does that do for you? Well, it's going to give me more authority. It's going to help more people believe in the work that I do. It's going to help people take me seriously. Awesome. But what does that do for you? When people take you seriously, when they believe in the work that you do, what does that do for you? Not for someone else. I'm not looking for an answer here that's external. More money might help you support your family, but that's an external reason. I'm looking for what does supporting your family do for you? And what we're after here is we're after the core reason that you are interested in podcasting. It's not the surface reason, the thing that first comes up. It's not even the reason behind that. At the core of it all, we're looking for what does a podcast do for you? What does it give you? Because in order for you to succeed as a podcaster, you have to know what it does for you first, then the impact that that's going to have on others. For me, my internal driver is because given my voice history, literally being told throughout my childhood that your voice doesn't matter. Literally, your voice is what gets you in trouble, was what I heard almost every day of my life. And then fast forwarding to my mid-20s where I almost lost my voice permanently due to thyroid cancer. Podcasting is a way for me to challenge myself every day to show up and use my voice to help others, to use my voice to create what I hope is meaningful change in the world. And in doing so, here's where the external driver comes in, to help others through the vehicle of podcasting do the same. So you don't care about my internal driver. And this is an important distinction because in order for a podcast to succeed, you have to know what's driving you. But you also have to know what's driving your listeners to listen. And they're going to be two different things. Now, ideally, we want those things to intersect because without it, you're going to get really frustrated at the process of podcasting. So if you need to pause this episode right now and actually think through this, don't just be like, I'm going to come back to it later and I'm going to think through it because we both know you're not going to do that. Pause it right now and then come back to me. Think about it and then come back to me so that we can break down now what a podcast can and cannot do for you based on where you are in your journey so you can set accurate expectations. Not realistic. Notice I didn't say realistic, but accurate expectations of what your podcast can do for you at each stage. What I also want you to notice, even though this episode is about monetizing a podcast, I'm curious, did your internal driver have anything to do with revenue? I will put my money on the answer of it didn't. Why? Because money is a means to an end. And so yes, we want our podcast to make us money. But whether or not the podcast makes you money is not the end goal. And so getting clear on what the end goal actually is helps you to detach from the means to the end, because there's lots of means to an end. If you are a runner and suddenly you were in an accident and you lost the use of your legs and you were so depressed and so sad because you were like, running gave me this sense of freedom. It gave me this sense of aliveness. It gave you whatever it gave you, the reasons that you run. I don't know because I don't run. But for you, if you're a runner, right, what does it give you? And if you suddenly lost the means to that end, you would find another way to get that end. You would find another way because that's what you value. That end is important to you. And this is why you see all of these incredible people who have, prosthetics and wheelchairs and yet they race. They do Ironmans, they do triathlon, and they're incredible because the means to an end is not the end in itself. The end is what you want. The means is just how we get there. And there's many different paths to get to what we want. So when you can detach from my podcast needs to make me money, guess what? It's going to be a lot easier for your podcast to make you money. And it's going to be a lot more fun. And money's going to come a whole lot more easily. And you're not going to be attached to the podcast needing you to make money right away, but rather you're going to see it as a piece of a greater whole that can and eventually should drive revenue so that you can achieve your greater end goal, which is why you're podcasting in the first place. So look, I know you're eager to fix this, but we're going to pause right here because I want you to do this work, okay? It's so easy to just say, well, you know what? Give me the answer. Give me the next thing to do. But no, I'm going to challenge you right now to stop, to pause, and to do this homework, to actually answer these questions. Now, if you already have answered these questions as we are going through this, then kudos to you and you have my permission to move forward to the next episode. But if you haven't done it yet, then what I want you to do right now is challenge yourself to slow down to go fast. Stop and answer these questions because the sooner that you can identify your internal driver and how that relates to your external driver, the easier it will be to make money from your podcast. And in the next episode, I'm going to show you how no matter where you are in your journey, whether you don't have an offer and don't plan to have one, whether you have an offer that's not converting yet, or whether you have an offer that is converting well that you want to utilize your podcast to leverage, I'll show you how to utilize your podcast to help you leverage wherever you are to help you get the results that you're actually here to get out of your show. And that's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.